All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class, C.S. Lewis Beyond Narnia. Today will be the final lesson in which we cover C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. So we've been covering that one for the past several weeks now. We've looked at Out of the Silent Planet, we've looked at Perelandra, and most recently we've looked at That Hideous Strength. Today, as you'll see from our class schedule here, we're going to talk about the influence of Dante in the Ransom Trilogy. So this is a special Sunday school lesson. I was hoping that we'd be able to have time for this, and it turns out that we've rearranged the schedule, so we do. Next week, we will be beginning a 2-week unit on the screw tape letters that's going to be taught by our co-teacher, Byron Earnhardt, who I don't see in the room at the moment. Maybe he'll be showing up later. But that will begin next week. So if you are a fan of screw tape, don't miss next week. But today, my focus is going to be on this book right here called Reflecting the Eternal, Dante's Divine Comedy in the Novels of C.S. Lewis by Marsha Daigle-Williamson. I just found out Marsha Daigle-Williamson passed away in the year 2020 from cancer, but she was a well-known and well-respected C.S. Lewis scholar. And in this book, she looks at the chief influence of C.S. Lewis on his fictional work. So Lewis's primary influence of all of the sources from the classical and medieval and Renaissance world that shaped his thought, probably at the top of that list would be Dante himself. I mentioned other influences as well, like Plato and Augustine and Boethius, but I do think Dante takes the cake. As the author here points out, you find the influence of Dante in all of Lewis's fictional writings. So what I intend to do this morning is cover the chapters from this book that talk about the influence of Dante in the 3 books of the Space Trilogy. And then if we have time, we'll try and use this book for the other remaining books in this class as well. We'll see how that goes. But in order to give you some of the context for our discussion today, you have to know a little bit about Dante. So, by a show of hands, how many of you have read anything by Dante in the Divine Comedy? Inferno, Purgatory, Paradiso? Okay, I see several hands up. Has anybody read the entire Divine Comedy? Okay, all the hands go down. Okay. Yeah, it is quite the challenge. Most people, if they've read anything, they've read the Inferno. And I would agree, if there's only one book that you could read, go with the Inferno. It's probably the most concrete, it has the most gripping plot. By the time you get to the Paradiso, Dante becomes more and more symbolic, more and more abstract. Very profound thoughts, but it is kind of hard to follow if you don't have like thorough footnotes or endnotes to help you make sense of what's going on. So, for those of you who ever intend to read the entire Divine Comedy, here's the translation that I would recommend to you. This is the one that I just finished last year. It's by Anthony Esolen. And so he has written a more modernized translation of the Divine Comedy. What I like about Esolen's translations is that he includes footnotes and endnotes to help provide context to make sense of the books as you read through them. So some of the historical figures, the philosophical references, all of that gets explained in the endnotes. That said, let me also give you some of the historical background to who Dante was. So Dante is widely considered to be the greatest poet of all time. In this class, I've mentioned how I would consider the Divine Comedy to be the greatest work of literature ever written. And I think most literary experts would probably agree with me on that, or at least that would be a reasonable claim to make. But Dante himself was from the region of Florence, Italy, in the 13th, 14th century. And so he wrote his Divine Comedy in the early 1300s. And you should know a little bit about like the political and religious context of Italy at the time. At the time Dante was writing, Florence was kind of in the midst of its own civil war. You had these rival factions within Florence. You had the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And they each had their different alliances. I think like one side was allied with like the King of France, another side was allied with the Pope. And so it turned out that Dante, if I remember correctly, I'm really wishing John Hodges was here this morning, Dante was on the side of the Guelphs. But there was also sub-factions within the Guelphs as well. There were the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs, and if I remember right, Dante was a white Guelph at a time when the black Guelphs came to power in Florence. And so he was exiled from his city because he basically backed the wrong horse. He was on the wrong side of that factional rivalry within Florence. So his exile led him to this, essentially a midlife crisis. It was a point of despair. He was a pretty well-to-do guy, pretty prosperous, but he essentially lost everything when he was exiled. So you might recall that's very similar to what happened with Boethius, who we've mentioned earlier in this class. You know, he was like a Roman statesman in the court of the barbarian king Theodoric after the fall of the Roman Empire. He was falsely accused of treason, and then he was exiled and ultimately executed. Dante, fortunately, wasn't executed, but he did spend exile. If I remember right, I don't think he was ever allowed to return to Florence after that. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's right. But it was during his exile, when he was sort of in the depths of this despair, he writes the greatest work of literature of all time. That is what the Divine Comedy is. And what he does is he synthesizes all of his knowledge of the classical and medieval world, much like what Boethius had done before him. He takes history, mythology, poetry, philosophy, and theology, and he weaves all of those threads together into this beautiful tapestry that we now know as the Divine Comedy. And so, in the plot of the Divine Comedy, it's written in the first person, where Dante describes himself as this pilgrim who is taking on a journey through hell, and then through purgatory, and then through the spheres of heaven to finally behold the face of God in paradise, in the highest heaven. And so that is the structure of the Divine Comedy. And so it begins with a scene like this, where Dante describes himself as being at the midpoint of life's journey. So he's like, late 30s, maybe around 40, when the narrative begins. And he finds himself in a dark wood, and he doesn't know how to escape. And yes, you'll notice that I'm going to use some ChatGPT images this morning. So it's kind of my thing right now. But Dante, he finds his exit from the forest blocked by these three savage beasts. There's a lion, and there's a she-wolf, and there is a leopard. Now, literary critics generally associate these three beasts with the three categories of sin that are described in Inferno. There is the sin of incontinence, there is the sin of violence, and the sin of fraud. I'm going to explain that in just a moment, but that is kind of like what these animals are thought to symbolize. But then at that point where he thinks he's going to be, torn apart by these wild beasts, a man, or the appearance of a man, shows up. Does anybody know who this man is that appears to Dante at this moment? Virgil. Who knows who Virgil was historically? He was a Roman poet. He was the author of the Aeneid, which was an epic poem that describes the founding of Rome by Aeneas, who is one of the refugees of Troy who fled after the fall of Troy during the Trojan War. So it's basically, the Aeneid is Virgil's attempt to do for Rome what Homer did for Greece. And so Virgil was widely considered to be like the greatest poet in history. He was also a symbol of virtue. He's about as virtuous as you could get as a pagan. And so he becomes Dante's guide through hell and then through purgatory as well. But because he's not a believer, he's not permitted access to heaven. So his dwelling place is in limbo, which is the highest circle of hell, which I'm going to describe in just a moment. But he is authorized by heaven to accompany Dante through all the circles of hell. And he basically, you could say he gets a day pass to go to purgatory. So he can guide Dante through the levels of purgatory towards the top of the mountain of purgatory. At that point in the narrative, Dante says he falls unconscious, and he talks about how he was taken on a boat and crosses the river Acheron, which is, I think, is that like one of the tributaries of the river Styx or something like that in Greek mythology? Basically, it brings you to the entrance place of Hades. And that's what it does for Dante as well. When he wakes up, he finds himself at the entrance to hell. And this is probably, the most familiar line from the Divine Comedy. You know what's the inscription on the gateway to hell? Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So from that point, Virgil leads Dante through the various circles of hell. And there's a purpose for this. Remember, at this point in Dante's life, he's at a spiritual low point. And Virgil says to Dante, if you want to experience redemption, the way up is the way down. He's going to have to come to a realization of the depths of sin and vice in order to understand the meaning of divine grace. And in that process, his soul will be purified and he will be able to enter into union with God. So that's kind of the driving purpose of this spiritual journey. So it is on the one hand like a physical journey through the different regions of the afterlife, but it's also a spiritual journey at the same time, because through this physical journey, Dante himself undergoes this spiritual transformation, a conversion experience, you could say. But it begins with him experiencing the different forms of sin in the circles of hell. So I found this chart on Google here, and so some of you might be familiar with how the Inferno is structured if you've read it. So like I said, the top circle of hell is limbo. This is where virtuous pagans and unbaptized babies would go. It's not a place of torment, but it is a place of unfulfilled hope and longing. So that's the description of that first circle of hell. That's where Virgil himself dwells. But then, as they descend lower and lower through the other circles of hell, I mentioned earlier those three beasts that Dante had encountered in the dark wood before going to hell. So one of those beasts represents the top circles of hell, which are described as incontinence. And I know that word today means something else if you go to Walgreens. But in the classical and medieval tradition, incontinence referred to the lack of self-control. Your inability to control your basic appetites, your desire for food or for sex, those basic desires within you. If you can't exercise control over those, that indicates a lack of continence, a lack of self-control. These would be the lesser sins within hell. And Dante, I think appropriately, says the majority of people in the afterlife in hell are residing in these circles. Most people that are unbelievers are not as evil can be. Your average next door secular neighbor is not Hitler, right? And so Dante appropriately describes hell as with the majority of the population in these upper circles. So the highest of these circles within the circle of incontinence would be lust, and then it would be gluttony, and then it would be avarice and prodigality. So these are the sins of money. You're either spending it too irresponsibly or you're hoarding it too irresponsibly. And then you have the circle of wrath and sullenness. So look, each of these circles, what do they have in common? A lack of self-control. It's a lack of self-control over your sexual desire or over your eating habits or your use of wealth or over your temper. But then we move from the sins of the appetite to the sins of the will. This would be the circles of violence. So like when we get to like heresy and violence, for example, at these levels, it's not just about a lack of self-control. You are actually willing harm to someone else. Here's something also important to note about Dante's use of the word violence. Normally today, when we talk about violence, we're talking about what? Like inflicting physical pain on somebody else, right? That is not actually what violence meant in the classical and medieval tradition. Violence was actually any act of willful rebellion against God, against yourself, against the created order even. And so, like, for example, even though lust would be, that second circle of hell, homosexuality is actually considered a sin of violence within Dante's scheme. And so, because any sort of sin that functions as a revolt against God's natural design for humanity, that itself would be a form of violence. And then below that, you get in beyond the sins of the will and to the sins of the mind. So as you see, the lower you go, it corresponds to the corruption of the higher parts of human nature, right? So it begins with your base appetites, and then it moves to the sins of the will, and finally to the sins of the mind. And so the corruption of your intellect is what's involved in fraud, right? Where you're using your mind to deceive others, to manipulate others. And then the lowest circle of all, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, it would be the circle of the traitors, treason, treachery, which is itself subdivided into different forms of treachery. So there are traitors against their kindred, there's traitors against their nation, there's traitors against guests, and then you know who the worst of the traitors are? Traitors against their benefactors or their lords, those who actually bestowed benefit and blessing upon them and favor upon them. So once you get to the very bottom of hell, who do we find? Satan himself, who actually has 3 heads, and he's actually chewing on 3 different individuals. Who are the 3 people that Satan is tormenting in that lowest circle of hell? Does anybody know? That's right, Judas, Cassius, and Brutus. So Judas, you know, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Who were Brutus and Cassius? They were the assassins of Julius Caesar. That's right. That's right. So he was their benefactor, and they betrayed him. So that's why Dante portrays them as in this lowest circle of hell, along with Judas Iscariot. So as the narrative goes, this approaches the end of the Inferno. From there, so also it's worth mentioning that in Dante's cosmology, hell is actually located physically in the depths of the earth. So he literally goes downward to the center of the earth. In Dante's worldview, the world is a globe. But at the very core of the earth, that's where Satan's hell is. And it's not a place of fiery torment. It's actually freezing cold, interestingly. There is fiery torment in certain circles of hell, but the lowest circle, it's described as frigid, freezing. But Dante and Virgil, they pass by Satan, and then they start working their way through the other side of the globe. So down becomes up. And they work their way all the way up to the surface of the earth on the other side of the globe, which brings them in proximity of the island of Mount Purgatory. And that brings us to the beginning of the second volume of the Divine Comedy, where Virgil leads Dante to the entrance of Purgatory, and he encounters there the so-called late repenters, and also the excommunicated by the church. In Dante's theology, this was something where he was different from the Catholic Church's teaching at the time. Dante still thought that those who were excommunicated could still go to heaven. That was kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. But Dante recognized that those who were excommunicated, they might still have the possibility of repentance. And so in Dante's portrayal of them, they do have to wait an additional amount of time even before they're allowed to enter purgatory. And so you have this gathering of souls outside of purgatory who either delayed repentance until the very end of their lives or those who are excommunicated. But it's at that point where Dante is allowed to go through the entrance of purgatory, but he also finds he has a letter that's inscribed on his forehead 7 times. Does anybody, if you've read it, does anybody know which letter is inscribed on his forehead 7 times? It's the letter P, which in Italian, or maybe it's Latin, I can't remember, is peccato, which is the word sin. Because purgatory is structured sort of like inversely from hell, where each of the terraces of Mount Purgatory corresponds to one of the 7 deadly sins. Or more properly speaking, we wouldn't call it a sin, we should call it a vice, because it's a habit of the heart rather than a specific action, although of course vices lead to specific sins. In hell, you are condemned for what you've done. But in purgatory, the purpose is to purge souls who are on their way to heaven. So the vices that are still clinging to their hearts need to be purified. And there's an interesting structure in both Inferno and Purgatory where Dante uses this literary device called contrapasso. Basically, that means the punishment fits the crime. And so for whatever the sin was in hell, you basically have to do like the mirror opposite of that as your punishment. Take like the circle of the greedy, the avaricious in hell. What are they condemned to do for the rest of their life? Throw boulders at each other. Because on the one hand, you had the hoarders who were keeping worldly goods to themselves. And then you had the spendthrifts, the prodigals who were wastefully giving away all they had. And so what happens is there's this conflict between the miserly and the spendthrifts in the circle of the avaricious, where they're just throwing boulders that symbolizes the futility of earthly wealth. Similarly, when you move to purgatory, the lowest of the terraces, which is like the base of all of the vices, is pride. And how are the souls there? Well, it's not exactly a punishment, it's a purification rite. It's a purification process. But what do they have to do? They have to carry large boulders on their shoulders, which force them to stoop down low to the earth. And they have to make their way up the terrace until they are finally purged of that vice. And so you can see there's like a punishment that fits the crime. As Dante ascends each level of Mount Purgatory, he finds that one of the P's on his forehead gets erased. And so he himself is undergoing a purification process. He's first cleansed of his pride, then envy, and then wrath, sloth, then avarice, then gluttony, and lust. By the time he reaches the top of Mount Purgatory, this is where it gets interesting. You know what's at the top of Mount Purgatory? The Garden of Eden. It is a repristinated Garden of Eden. That is as far as Virgil is allowed to go. Once they reach that level, Virgil has to return. Dante looks back and he's just gone. He didn't even have a chance to say goodbye. Because at this point in the narrative, Dante has a new guide. There's actually 2 different women described in Eden. Does anybody know who is the first woman that Dante encounters in Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory? Her name is Matilda. Now, Matilda, literary critics have different theories about what she represents, but it is evident from the narrative that she represents unfallen humanity. We're going to come back to that idea in just a moment. Unfallen humanity. She is also the one who brings Dante to 2 rivers that are flowing through this garden at the top of Mount Purgatory. It's the rivers Lethe and Eunoe. Lethe is the Greek word for forgetfulness, because this is the river where when you're submerged in it, you forget your past sins. And then there's the river Eunoe, which means goodwill. This is the river that reminds you of your good deeds in life. Once you pass through these rivers, then you are cleansed and prepared to ascend through the spheres of heaven. So essentially, Matilda baptizes Dante in these waters so that he forgets his memory of his past sins, and he remembers the good deeds of his life. And then he's brought to another woman. Who is this other woman after Matilda? Beatrice, who was a real historical figure, by the way. In Dante's telling, Beatrice was a citizen of Florence who passed away at a young age. She'd gotten married to someone else, but Dante believed she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And she also represented virtue and grace, and that's her role in the Divine Comedy as well. So she's a heavenly spirit, and she is the one who summoned Dante to undergo this spiritual journey. And so in the Divine Comedy, she symbolizes spiritual conversion, she symbolizes divine grace, and Dante's own character transformation. So this is how the Purgatory ends. He's at the summit of Mount Purgatory on the Garden of Eden. He finally meets the spirit of Beatrice, who is now ready to accompany him and guide him through the spheres of heaven in Paradiso. So this brings us to the 3rd volume. And so you may remember this if you were in our Sunday school class on Planet Narnia, last year. But this was the medieval cosmological system where each planet resided within a particular sphere that was rotated by a heavenly intelligence or an angel. And in Dante's telling, each sphere corresponds to a different category of saint. So the lowest sphere of heaven would be the moon. This is the sphere of the inconstant. These are saints who are redeemed and they're in heaven, but these are believers who had broken monastic vows, although for forgivable reasons. So there, for example, I think there's the Lady Constance here who had joined a convent, but then her family forced her into a political marriage. And so technically, she could have said no, it would have cost her her life, but she could have said no to that arrangement. But she agreed to go along with it, but in the process, she broke her monastic vow. She's still allowed to go to heaven, but she's in the lowest circle of heaven. Beyond that, you have the sphere of the ambitious. These would be like rulers who were maybe a little bit too much focused on political affairs. They were godly people, but they were maybe a little too earthly minded. Beyond that, you have the sphere of the lovers, those who have spiritual and earthly love. And maybe they were a little bit too passionate in their love, but they did have the spiritual virtue of charity. By the time you get to the Son, these are the pure saints. So you have the sphere of the wise. These would be like the philosophers, like Thomas Aquinas. Boethius himself is in this sphere. Then in the circle of Mars, this is the sphere of the warriors, those who exercise bravery. Martyrs are in this sphere as well. Beyond that, Jupiter, this is the sphere of the rulers, the good kings, the best of the kings. Beyond that, the circle of Saturn would be the contemplatives, those who devoted themselves to the mystical life, those who experienced tragedy and loss but drew closer to God as a result of it. Beyond that, you have the sphere of the fixed stars. This is where the angels reside. Beyond that, it was thought there was like a sphere that was the source of movement for all of the lower spheres. This was called the Prima Mobile. And then lastly, you get to the sphere of the Empyrean, which is where God himself resides. Beatrice takes Dante through all of these spheres, and finally, at the end of his journey, he sees an entire heavenly host converging on a single point of light. And this light represents God himself, and this is Dante's own experience of what theologians call the beatific vision. Okay, so that is the happy sight of God himself. This is humanity's highest reward, our highest delight in heaven. This is what we're made for. And Dante gets a glimpse of it in his Divine Comedy at the very end. So that's my summary of the plot of Dante's Divine Comedy. This is going to help us now to understand how does C.S. Lewis weave the Divine Comedy into the Ransom Trilogy. This is going to bring us into our book by Marsha Daigle-Williamson, and I want to begin with a quote where she's talking about Lewis's reason for writing the Ransom Trilogy. You may recall I've previously mentioned how Lewis wrote these books as sort of a counter-argument to some of the science fiction authors of his day, who were very materialistic, who had maybe like transhumanist ambitions, we would say today. So here's how Marsha Daigle-Williamson puts it. One of the main factors that distinguishes Lewis's book from those of H.G. Wells and David Lindsay, who are contemporary science fiction authors, is that he is restoring a Christian character to the cosmos that the science fiction writers of his time had universally discarded. In so doing, Lewis draws on the Divine Comedy as a model. He follows Dante's methodology for constructing an imaginative vision of a Christian cosmos by combining elements from science, philosophy, and mythology into a cohesive new unity. In addition, the Divine Comedy provides Lewis with a prototype of a journey into the heavens whose significance is primarily spiritual. So Lewis draws from patterns of that prototype for Ransom's journey and for his meeting with this novel's Beatrice. And we'll talk about who is that Beatrice in just a moment. So here is how she structures the chapter that she devotes to each of the 3 books of the Ransom Trilogy. She talks about how Dante influences the inhabitants of that novel, the influence of Dante on the journey of the main characters within the novels, and then there's a Beatrice figure within each of the novels. So what we're going to do is look at how does Dante influence these 3 elements of each novel within the Ransom Trilogy, beginning with Out of the Silent Planet. Now, I should say, it's kind of neat to look at these literary connections, but we also have to keep in mind, like, theologically, what are we trying to do with a class like this? We're trying to grow in spiritual maturity. We're trying to grow closer to God in our understanding of who he is and who we are as redeemed sinners. But there are different routes that we can take to achieve that goal. One route would be to give you like a systematic theology course, and I could do that all day and twice on Sunday. In fact, that's what I have done. So, but another route to accomplishing that would be to awaken your imagination. Do you ever wonder, why did Jesus primarily teach in parables? He could have just given lessons in ethics and systematic theology to communicate the same point, right? In fact, that might have been very much clearer in another respect. But that's not what Jesus did. He taught with parables. Why? So that we would think it, so that it would get to the core of who we are. We're not just intellectual creatures. We're creatures of love and imagination. And so as we explore these connections between Dante and C.S. Lewis, keep in mind that this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get at these spiritual truths about God and ourselves by means of our imagination. So it's not just trivial literary connections that I'm highlighting here. I'm doing this in order to give you a deeper understanding and appreciation of who God is and who we are in relation to him. That said, let's look at these connections that Marsha Daigle-Williamson highlights between Dante and C.S. Lewis. Beginning with the inhabitants of Out of the Silent Planet. She describes three similarities between the cosmos of Dante and the cosmos of C.S. Lewis. These three similarities she describes as nature versus sky, which is an old Aristotelian distinction, angelic agents, and the music of the spheres. These are 3 points that the Divine Comedy has in common with Out of the Silent Planet. What do I mean by this distinction between nature and sky? Within the medieval cosmology, there was a dividing line between the realm above and the realm below, and that dividing line was actually the moon. So anything that dwelt below the moon was considered the region of the air. You know how, where is it that the Bible describes, Satan as the prince of the power of the air? What, I can't remember. Is that Ephesians? I should have, maybe it's 2 Corinthians. It's in there somewhere. But that idea was taken up in medieval cosmology to symbolize that the realm of below the moon was under the reign of sin. It was self-directed. This is where Satan and his demons dwell. But once you move beyond the moon, that symbolized God's dominion, the realm of the angelic beings and the redeemed spirits in heaven. There's something similar going on in that scheme in both Dante and C.S. Lewis. Now, Dante talks about how before Dante ascends beyond the circle of the moon, the world is governed by the rules of time and space and gravity. So, for example, Dante gets tired. He needs to sleep. Whether he's in hell or in purgatory, he gets exhausted, he gets fearful. But by the time Dante ascends beyond the moon, he no longer gets tired. His notion of time and space is now completely reoriented. He's now operating according to the heavenly laws of time and space. There's a spiritual law of gravity, whereas, physical gravity pulls us down. The spiritual law of gravity pulls you upwards because your love draws you towards your divine source, which is God himself. Lewis does something similar in Out of the Silent Planet. So you may recall how within the worldview of the Ransom Trilogy, angels are called Eldils, and there's a ruling Eldil over each of the planets within the solar system. But who's the Eldil of Earth? It's the bent one, right? It's Satan himself, the rebel. He initiated this cosmic revolt against Maleldil, which is, the Son of God. And for that reason, Earth was put under quarantine. And it's called the Silent Planet. It's cut off from communication from the rest of the solar system. And so, whereas heaven is under the rule of Maleldil, everything below the moon is under the dominion of the bent one, the Oyarsa, the Eldil who revolted against Maleldil. So you can see there's a connection there. Moving to the angelic agents themselves, Dante talks about how there was a heavenly intelligence or angelic spirit that moved each of the spheres of heaven. So each sphere had its own presiding angel. And also Dante talks about how the angels played a role in shaping Earth's flora and fauna. Very interesting. They did not directly create human beings. That was an act of God himself. But Dante creatively describes the angels as participating in the development of Earth as a dwelling place for humans. Lewis picks up on these ideas as well. He talks about how the Oyarsas are a combination of classical mythology, Plato's demigods, and Dante's angels. And so, similarly, although they're not rotating heavenly spheres, Lewis has given up on that from Dante's cosmology because, Lewis is aware of modern science. You don't have spheres that are rotating the planets. But he still has angels presiding over each of the planets within the solar system. He also describes the Oyarsas as playing a role in forming the non-rational creatures on each planet. So there are all kinds of interesting connections there between Dante and Lewis. And then lastly, this notion of the music of the spheres. So within the classical worldview, it was thought that as the spheres of heaven rotate, there's a kind of music that they produce. But on earth, we're deaf to it because of our own sin, because of our selfishness. But there's a harmony that is communicated in the spheres of heaven. And Dante himself can start to hear this music as soon as he begins to ascend into the heavens. Now, as Dante describes it, the source of the music is not from the spheres themselves, as earlier authors would have written, but according to Dante's portrayal, the music is coming from the redeemed spirits who dwell within each sphere. And so there's a certain harmony that exists among the different saints in heaven. We see then in heaven there is a certain kind of hierarchy, right? There are different levels, spheres of heaven, but the saints are joined together harmoniously in the same purpose, which is giving God glory. Lewis picks up on this notion as well. So the very idea of Earth being the silent planet corresponds to this idea that there are spheres of producing music in heaven. But there's also a harmony in the social hierarchy that we see on planet Malacandra, Mars. So you might remember there's 3 classes of intelligent aliens on Mars. There's the Harosa, the Sorns, and then the Fiffletrigs. That's a mouthful, I know. But they each have different roles on Mars, right? They each have different specialties, but they dwell together in this harmony where each has a purpose of its own, a role of its own. And so Lewis is trying to depict the harmony of the heavenly spheres in the way he's arranged society. Likewise, as we move to the journeys of Dante and Ransom, we see some similarities as well. So at the beginning of their journey, they're both described as being in a state of fear. Their journeys, in both cases, were ordained by heaven. In the case of Dante, it was Beatrice who was attempting to summon him. In Ransom's case, it was the Oyarsa of Malacandra, so the chief Eldil, the chief angel who rules over Malacandra, was trying to summon him. They're both described as falling unconscious and then reawakening as their journey begins. So Dante had reawakened after crossing the river Acheron to reach the entrance to hell. Ransom, you may recall, was drugged by Weston and Devine, and then he wakes up in a spaceship as they're departing Earth's orbit. During their journey, Dante and Ransom both get an education in sin. Dante is instructed in the nature of sin and evil and punishment, whereas Ransom recognizes the extent of the sinfulness of humanity in his own encounters with the inhabitants of Mars. And so they both come to this realization of the true nature of sin, though in different ways. Now, in some of these cases, maybe the connections that she's drawing between Dante and C.S. Lewis are coincidental, but we know that in many of these cases, Lewis himself admitted that he was drawing from Dante. And so we should not be surprised where these literary connections look more than coincidental. Both characters begin their journeys in a state of fear. They have this fearful demeanor. Dante is described with having fear and timidity at almost every step of the way through hell. And then Ransom, when he finally encounters the Oyarsa of Malacandra towards the end of the novel, the Oyarsa says to Ransom, "You are guilty of no evil except a little fearfulness." This is kind of the besetting sin of Ransom, which he has to overcome, both in this novel and then again he has to receive education and courage on Paralandra. And then their departures from their journeys are described similarly as well. So Dante, as he's passing by Satan, the colors are described as yellow and red and black in the faces of Satan. He passes through Earth's center and experiences like a reorientation of Earth's gravity, and then he exits through a small round opening of a tunnel at the other end of the Earth. Interestingly, Ransom's departure from Mars is described in very similar terms. After his spaceship lifts off, he looks at the surface of Mars and he sees yellow and red against a black sky. I don't know, was Lewis deliberately drawing these colors from Dante's descent to the center of the lowest circle of hell? Possibly. Ransom also experiences a reorientation of gravity as the spaceship leaves Mars's orbit. And then upon landing on Earth, Ransom exits through the ship's manhole. A lot of the wording may just be coincidental, but these coincidences happen so frequently that you do kind of wonder maybe Lewis is deliberately drawing connections. So we do see in many cases parallels between Dante's descent through Inferno and Ransom's journey to Mars and back. So that raises a question as we wrap up this discussion on Out of the Silent Planet. Who would be the Beatrice figure for Ransom in Out of the Silent Planet? Well, I've mentioned it already. It would be the Oyarsa, the chief Eldil, who rules over the planet. And so I think we see several similarities between the Oyarsa of Mars and Beatrice. Just take a look at the settings. This, I am convinced, is more than just coincidence. The way that Lewis described Meldalorn, which is the city where the Oyarsa lives, it's very, very similar to the way the Garden of Eden is described at the top of Mount Purgatory. They're both located on the summits of mountains. In the case of Meldalorn, it's on an island that rises like a gently sloping pyramid in the midst of a lake. And then they're both described as having like an ancient forest at the top. So Dante strolls through this ancient forest through Eden. Ransom himself sees a grove of trees at the peak of Meldalorn. They're both described as taking very slow steps. And they're both described as being eager to explore their surroundings in these new surroundings. In many cases, I think the wording is almost identical. So I do think that Lewis was deliberately trying to echo Dante's description of Eden here. Then also look at the conversations. The conversations that take place on the one hand between Dante and Beatrice, and on the other hand between Ransom and Oyarsa. Dante is accused by Beatrice of misdeeds. And so she functions as a kind of heavenly judge initially. She accuses Dante of having turned his face away from her. And so she had prayed for inspiration through dreams to call him back to her, but those attempts had failed. Beatrice frequently answers Dante's unasked questions, and then she gives Dante an account of the spiritual history of the Christian church, and she prophesies the future deliverance of the church from various evils. Now look at how the conversation between Ransom and the Oyarsa unfolds. Ransom is described as feeling as if the Malacandrians and the Eldos were waiting for his trial to begin. So there's like a court scene feeling to the dialogue. The Oyarsa says to Ransom, "You've spent all your time in flying from me," just like Dante was trying to flee from Beatrice without realizing it. And the Oyarsa had attempted various means to summon him, through the sea monster, the Hanakra, and then through an Eldil messenger. And so Ransom was constantly missing these messages from the Oyarsa. There is a point where it says Ransom was silent, but the Oyarsa answered his unspoken questions, exactly what Beatrice did for Dante. Then Ransom hears an account of the spiritual history of the universe from the Oyarsa. And then the Oyarsa gives a prophecy about what's going to happen for the silent planet, Thulkandra, Earth. The year we are now in has long been prophesied as a year of stirrings and high changes, and the siege of Thulkandra may be near its end. Probably more than a coincidence, right? I think it's pretty fair to say that Lewis is deliberately portraying the Oyarsa of Malacandra as a Beatrice figure here. So that's my summary of Out of the Silent Planet. Briefly, I want to cover the remaining two novels as well. There's a lot of material, but I got to stay within our time limit. So now, moving to Perelandra. Remember, we're looking at the question of inhabitants, journey, and Beatrice. So let's look at how Dante influences each of those elements of the novel, Perelandra. So on the one hand, in Dante's writing, pagan mythology is essentially Christianized. We see figures from Greco-Roman mythology, but they're given a Christian function. So Cerberus, you guys know the three-headed dog? So he has a role in the circle of the gluttons. The Minotaur has a role in the circle of the violent. And then the river Lethe. You remember, I mentioned that earlier. That is the river of forgetfulness. Now, in Greek mythology, the river Lethe basically makes you forget all of your past life. But Dante gives it a more Christian symbolism by saying, no, it removes the memory of your guilt, your sinful actions in your past life. And so also, Eden is described as like the Garden of the Hesperides. Do you guys know who the Hesperides were? I believe they were like the nymphs, the daughters of Aphrodite or Venus, as I recall. And they dwelt in the west in a beautiful garden that grew golden apples. Those who in ancient times wrote poetry about the golden age and its happy state, he's describing the Garden of Hesperides, were perhaps dreaming of this place. That's what Dante said when he observed Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory. So this connection between Eden and the mythical Garden of the Hesperides. There's also this kind of like unprecedented fruit that Dante encounters in Purgatory. The Holy Land where you are has fruit that is not plucked on earth, it's said. And then remember the character Matilda. When Dante first encounters her, she's singing to herself, gathering flowers on the other side of a brook 3 paces away, then turns toward Dante, but she's not identified by name until much later in the novel. And then there's another garden described in purgatory at the beginning, at the ante-purgatory. This is the waiting place before you can enter purgatory, which contains gold, silver, red, and indigo-colored flowers, and it's visited nightly by the serpent that is believed to have tempted Eve. Compare all those elements to C.S. Lewis's descriptions in Perelandra. Again, Lewis does something very similar. He takes pagan mythology and he Christianizes it. So the god Mars, or Ares in Greek mythology, is described as the presiding angel of planet Malacandra. Venus, or Aphrodite, is the presiding angel of planet Perelandra. Venus itself is explicitly associated with the Garden of the Hesperides. So it says, Ransom recognized the Garden of the Hesperides at once when he saw the vegetation, the islands of planet Venus. Also, when Ransom eats of the fruits, he says it was the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men. And when he encounters the Green Lady on Perelandra, she's singing to herself, gathering flowers on the other side of a brook 5 feet away. She turns toward Ransom, and she's not identified by her name, which is Tinadril, until the very end of the novel. Interestingly, this we know for a fact that's not just a coincidental connection to Matilda. In a private letter of C.S. Lewis, he later wrote he got his inspiration for the Green Lady from the character Matilda in the Divine Comedy. So we know for a fact that connection was deliberate on C.S. Lewis's part. The gardens in Perelandra are described as containing yellow, silver, indigo, and red gold flora and fauna. And it's also the site of imminent temptation. So we see the settings are very much connected. The journeys that the characters experience, get this. So Ransom undergoes his own sort of character transformation on Perelandra that correspond to the different vices that are purged on Mount Purgatory. So beginning with, the vice of sloth. So Lewis himself, he's not like slavishly following the structure of Mount Purgatory, but each of the vices is alluded to in Perelandra. So sloth and zeal, how are those mentioned? It seems that he must have remained lying on his face, doing nothing and thinking nothing for a very long time. So when he first lands on Venus, Ransom is sort of in this state of stupor, doesn't know what to do, doesn't do anything. But then he has to remind himself of what his mission is, and he has to move forward. Gluttony, temperance, how does that appear? When he tastes of the fruit, he knows that it's better not to taste it again. So he knows he has to restrain his desire to try to taste the fruit again. Avarice and generosity. After experiencing the bubble trees, you remember there's like these bubbles that burst on you and give you this sense of refreshment. Ransom considers the itch to have things over again, and he wonders if that desire, rather than the love of money, might possibly be the root of all evil. Pride and humility. There's a point in which Ransom felt a momentary impatience in a conversation with the Green Lady because she laughs at him essentially when she sees like half of his body is sunburnt. And he reacts initially with this feeling of pride. But then he smiled in spite of himself and the very undistinguished career he was having on Perelandra. So he recovers a sense of humility. Lust and chastity. Even though the characters are naked in the novel Perelandra, it says that for Ransom, embarrassment and desire were both 1,000 miles away from his experience. How about anger and meekness? He's often frustrated in his conversations with the Green Lady because there's this communication barrier between them because she doesn't have a concept of sin. So Ransom is frequently stunned by some measureless anger. He has a feeling of angry frustration, but he learns to have patience. And then envy and kindness. This one's a little bit trickier, but I think you can make the argument that we see it portrayed because Ransom must help the Green Lady resist Weston's attempts to provoke her to envy the heroism or experiences of others. And so in all these ways, we see the vices of purgatory alluded to, but we see how Ransom overcomes them in the plot of Perelandra. Also, here's another interesting connection. The evil spirits described in Dante and in Perelandra. So in Dante, in the 9th circle of hell, which is the traitors of kindred, that's one of the subcircles, the souls of these characters, Alberigo and Branca Doria, are tormented in hell while their bodies are possessed by devils. It's exactly what happens to Weston in Perelandra when he's possessed by the Bent One or one of his lesser followers. In the 8th circle in Dante, which in the 5th ditch, so this circle is subdivided into different ditches of different sins. the sin of graft or political corruption, sinners are compared to frogs who are tormented by devils who claw into their backs. That is literally what Weston does in Perelandra. He takes delight in clawing into the backs of these frog-like creatures to mar the beauty and the pristine nature of Perelandra. And then lastly, Satan eternally is gnawing on Judas's back, his head, and sometimes strips the skin from his back. I know, gruesome. That's exactly how Weston fights Ransom when they actually, engage in physical combat. He uses his claw-like fingers to try to tear up Ransom's back. So again, I think even in the portrayal of evil spirits, we see these connections. Next question. I'm going to try and move quickly as we wrap this up. Who would be the Beatrice figure in Perelandra? If you've read the novel, who do you think would represent Beatrice? You think it might be the Oyarsa. Now, they don't... Right. You do see them at the very beginning when Ransom leaves Earth, and then you see them at the end when he reaches, that island. But Marsha Daigle-Williamson makes the argument that it's actually Tor and Tinadril when they show up. The conversation that they have with Ransom, in some ways, is the culmination of Ransom's education on Perelandra. Because once Ransom encounters them, what happens next? He participates in what's described as the Great Dance. And so there's this direct connection, I think, between the highest level of heaven in Dante's Paradiso, which is called the Empyrean, and the Great Dance, which is described by C.S. Lewis. They're both representations of the beatific vision. And here's how Marsha Daigle-Williamson puts it. Although Lewis adapts many of Dante's images for his Great Dance, he is not replicating that vision. He's presenting a variation, as Dante is, on a theme that was invented by neither of them. When Ransom sees complexity, diversity, and increased movement, the other sees simplicity, unity, and increased brightness. When Ransom is led to stillness, the other is led to movement. The difference in the outward shape of the two visions, however, does not eliminate the essential parallel that exists between them. For each vision signifies total union with God and signals the conclusion of a long, arduous journey by a pilgrim. And I think most importantly, they both symbolize the beatific vision. Now, very quickly, I'm going to try to move through that hideous strength. How do we see connections between Dante and that hideous strength? Well, let's begin with the inhabitants. Remember, there's sort of like two locations that are the center of the plot in that hideous strength. There's Belbury and there's St. Anne's. Belbury is the headquarters of the bad guys, the NICE. What does that stand for? The National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, I think something like that. And then St. Anne's is the name of the estate where the good guys live, led by Ransom himself, who's first described as Mr. Fisher King. Now, notice some of the connections between Dante's Inferno and Belbury, the headquarters of the NICE. Some of the names of the devils or the demons in Inferno, they have names like Evil Claws or Evil Tail or Wild Swine. How are the villains described? What names do they have in that hideous strength? They have names like Wither, Frost, Hardcastle, Feverstone. How do those names make you feel? What's your impression when you hear those names? Right. There's something a little bit inhuman about these names, right? That's deliberate on C.S. Lewis's part. Hell is repeatedly described as a prison in Inferno, just like Belbury is like a prison to Mark. He is told that no one goes out of the NICE. There's also, interestingly, in Inferno, like I mentioned earlier, in each circle of hell, the punishment fits the sin. That's the principle known as contrapasso. That's the literary device that Dante used. There's something like contrapasso that happens when each of the villains meets their demise at the very end of that hideous strength. They're each killed in a way that corresponds to their crime on earth. I'm not going to give away the details, though. You'd have to read the novel for yourself. Plus, it's kind of gruesome. All right, moving to St. Anne's, the good guys, there are interesting parallels to Purgatorio and Paradiso. In Purgatory and Paradise, there's an equality in hierarchy among the blessed spirits that reside in heaven, just like there's an equality in hierarchy among the company at St. Anne's. The souls in Purgatory are in the process of purification, just like the characters at St. Anne's are undergoing their own various stages of spiritual development. In Purgatory, Dante gives his initial obedience to Beatrice as she guides him then through Paradise. just like the characters give their initial obedience to Ransom, which counts initially as obedience to Maleldil. So Jane gives her obedience to Ransom before she even is sure whether or not she believes in Maleldil. A lot of connections there. But then there are also interesting connections between the two main characters. So there are two main characters in that hideous strength. There's Mark and Jane, husband and wife. Mark's journey through the NICE really does correspond to Dante's Inferno. Check this out. Other commentators besides Marsha Daigle-Williamson have noticed this as well. But Mark's own character development corresponds to the different circles of hell. So there is a limbo, even, not Mark himself doesn't begin in limbo. He begins in a sinful state. But there are characters that would correspond to limbo. So Bill Hengist is the guy who gets murdered because he tries to leave the NICE. But then we get to Mark's own character. The novel begins by describing how Mark is just interested in his marriage only for the physical pleasure of it. That's how Jane feels about it. So we begin with a description of Mark's sin of lust. Then there's the sin of gluttony. Mark drinks heavily with Feverstone and the others while discussing the NICE. Then there's the sin of avarice, where Mark dismisses his reservations about the NICE because it offers him a good salary. Then there's the sin of anger. Mark loses his temper when he can't get a clear description of his responsibilities. Then there's the sin of heresy. Mark dismisses Christianity as nonsense. There's also a character called Strake among the NICE, who's basically like an apostate priest or minister. Then there's the circle of violence. Mark himself is complicit in the NICE's staging of a riot in Edgestowe. Then the circle of fraud. Mark willingly writes false reports in newspapers in order to manipulate public opinion in favor of the NICE. And this all goes in order, too. That is definitely not a coincidence. Lastly, this is the turning point for Mark. He doesn't reach the lowest circle of hell. He's tempted to it. He's brought to the objective room, you may recall, where everything is kind of distorted. But he rejects that. He will not betray his humanity in that final act. And he turns towards the good and the true in the end. In that process, Marsha Daigle-Williamson highlights how there is a Virgil character for Mark. But it's sort of like the evil twin of Virgil. It would be Fairy Hardcastle herself, who's the guide through the NICE. Mark also has his own Beatrice figure in the novel. Who would be the Beatrice figure for Mark? It's actually his wife, Jane. She is sort of his North Star, his guiding light. She is the one that he remembers every time he is tempted to do something wrong, like what would Jane think? That's a thought that crosses his mind. Jane, on the other hand, her story parallels purgatory. And so she undergoes her own character transformation as well. And so I'm just going to cover this one much more briefly. But when she first meets the good guys at St. Anne's, she's described as wrestling with the initial vices on Mount Purgatory. So pride and envy and wrath. She has to deal with these in her own heart as well. But in the end, her character is transformed. And who is her Beatrice figure in the novel? Who do you think would be her Beatrice figure? It would be Ransom himself. It's the novel says that her world was unmade when she first encounters Ransom. And she recognizes that she wants to willingly give her obedience to this man because he represents pure goodness and pure virtue to her. There's also, lastly, a connection we cannot miss between Dante's Paradiso and the climax of the novel, the Descent of the Gods, where you have each of the chief Eldils, the Oyarsas from the different planets of the solar system, descending upon St. Anne's and infusing their power into Merlin so that he can be equipped to defeat the bad guys, the NICE. These character traits of the Oyarsas directly correspond to the spheres of heaven in Paradiso. This, I think, is also one of the more compelling arguments for Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis. The idea that each of the Chronicles of Narnia symbolizes one of the spheres of heaven of medieval worldview. So that was my crash course in how Dante has influenced the Ransom Trilogy. Lots of connections. There's a lot there to chew on. Hopefully that gives you a deeper understanding of sin and vice and redemption as well. What's the plan for next week? Screwtape. So if you're interested in the Screwtape letters, come back to hear Byron Earnhardt lead a 2-week lesson on the Screwtape letters. That's all I have for you. Sorry, we got to go. I covered a lot of material this morning. But can I pray for us and then we can head out? Okay. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this time that we have together to explore your truth, to explore your word, to explore the nature of what it means to be human, to recognize our sin and our vice, but also to appreciate the redemption you have offered us through your Son, Jesus Christ. And so we thank you for this time, Lord, and we give you the glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.